everyone. In this episode of Exceptional Environments, I'm going to be covering the classic 2001 Remedy game Max Payne. It seemed like an appropriate time to revisit the game, given that a remake's in the works at the moment. Hopefully, unlike many modern remakes and remasters, they won't mess it up, and they can deliver something as good as the original. I'd love to see the original Max Payne, with all of its style and tone carried forward with amazing up-to-date modern graphics and mechanics. Regardless of the outcome, at least we can always have the original game to enjoy and treasure. Max Payne is one of my all-time favourite video games due to its very unique style and atmosphere, making it perfect for this series. I also intend to cover Max Payne 2 in a future video, so this will focus purely on the first game for now. This will be a broad overview of the game. Please be aware that the discussion will contain full spoilers, so I recommend playing this great game first if you haven't already. Chapter 1 Overview. Max Payne 1 is the story of an NYPD cop turned undercover DEA agent. The titular character must infiltrate the Punchinello crime family, described as the worst mafia family in New York, in order to trace a nightmarish street drug known as Valkyria or V. The game is set in 2001, the same time as release. This is one of my favourite aspects of the game. It offers a compelling and sometimes surreal glimpse into a sort of alternate reality early 2000s New York City. It's really unlike anything else from the time period, giving the game a kind of time capsule feel that evokes a strong nostalgia, while still being quite different from the real New York of the era. One unique aspect of the game is that it uses a graphic novel format to tell its story. A graphic novel is sort of built into the game, appearing instead of cutscenes at set points. You can see the game's low budget on display here. Max is played by the writer of the game, Sam Lake. The other characters are played by various game developers in costume. Often the backdrops look like Photoshop manipulated images that have been green screened in, with a kind of haziness added to each image, which gives it style while also covering up the poor budget. Surprisingly, this kind of stylish but low rent delivery of the story isn't too cheesy, and isn't as poorly done as you might expect.
You'd make me work undercover in some hellhole. Sorry, Alex. Michelle and the baby come first. See? My last smoke. It's bad for the baby.
That's you, Max. A regular Boy Scout.
See, Alex.
Still on for poker Thursday night, right?
Like taking candy from a baby.
Max Payne is the only game I can think of that has actually done a story like this. It adds a lot of character to the game, and thanks to Sam Lake's generally excellent writing and storytelling, the material is elevated to something more than the sum of its parts. I'll be discussing the writing more later in the video, but needless to say, there is good reason that Sam Lake's writing is beloved by many in the gaming community. You can really tell the developers cared about their game and stretched their budget to the limit. Max Payne also borrows heavily from film noir in its design and presentation. Noir influences everything from the locations to the characters. In many ways, Max is the archetypal noir tough guy protagonist, though he is humanised by the tragic loss of his family early in the game. We are privy to his personal thoughts and narration in a way that mimics classic voiceover storytelling in older noir detective films. In fact, Max even goes as far as to compare himself to noir actors like Humphrey Bogart and the character Sam Spade.
I had taken on the role of the mythic detective, Bogart as Marlowe, or as Sam Spade going after the Maltese Falcon to unravel all the mysteries. I walked straight in, playing at Bogart, like I'd done 100 times before.
The most obvious and appropriate contemporary influences on Max Payne are The Matrix and John Woo's Inspector Tequila action films. The game was revolutionary at the time for incorporating shoot-dodge mechanics that allow you to fly through the air while shooting, and you can slow down time to dodge bullets and react to enemies more quickly. Strangely enough, I would say these influences are probably the weakest as a whole. Whereas they were constantly talked about when the game first came out, everyone was constantly comparing it to The Matrix, whereas now looking back, I don't really think it's that similar. It doesn't have any of the sci-fi elements, it simply borrowed the aesthetic of dodging bullets. I think this shows that story and substance is more important over time than flashy gameplay and action set pieces. Max Payne in many ways was an action game when it came out, but I would argue it's more of a narrative-driven game when you replay it. Let's jump into discussion of Max Payne's portrayal of New York City and what makes it iconic. Chapter 2, Noir York City. The New York City shown in Max Payne is twisted into a dystopian nightmare. Max seems to stand completely alone against an unending torrent of corruption and sordid crime. We visit the most rundown and degenerate parts of the city, and as a whole the metropolis seems to be run entirely by shady corporations and sleazy organised criminals. Its alleys and streets are infested with crazed drug addicts. There's an ongoing deadly snowstorm, and graffiti featuring the drug Valkyr is seen all around the city. Max even goes as far as to describe New York City as Noir York City.
When the darkness fell, New York City became something else, any old Sinatra song notwithstanding. Bad things happened in the night, on the streets of that other city, Noir York City.
I love the surreal storytelling here. Even if you haven't played the game, this part alone gives you a good example of what to expect. Crime in the city in particular is shown to be out of control to insane levels, largely as a result of the Valkyr drug epidemic. At one point, Max revisits a mafia stronghold and notes that the police have been killed by mafia goons in the street outside, seemingly to no response from the NYPD. In-game, the obvious reason for this is to simply use the police command vehicles to block off the street from the player. Narratively, however, it's shown that the mafia are apparently so strong that they're able to murder policemen without any consequence at all. One thing that's interesting throughout Max Payne is that Norse mythology is directly woven into the portrayal of the city. Max wears a subtle Nordic boat necklace. We have references to Aesir, Valhalla, Valkyr, Odin and Balder. At one point at the city docks, we get a broader reference to the river Styx as well. There is nothing in the game that points to supernatural events, except perhaps Max's heightened reflexes, but this seems to be explained by his use of painkiller pills and skills with guns. Regardless, these constant references to mythology contribute a lot to New York's fever dream nightmarish feel in the game. My favourite use of these mythical elements is the comparison of the city's conditions and the snowstorm to Ragnarok, the Viking concept of the end of the world. Max visits a shady nightclub with occult theming, run by a drug-frenzied mafioso named Jack Lupino. The club itself is actually called Ragnarok, with rock spelt R-O-C-K as in rock and roll. In the club, Max finds books on black magic and mythology that Lupino has been reading, and delivers this great introspection.
The book had never been a bestseller. Given the setting, I was surprised to find that somebody had been passing time reading. The paperback was entitled The Age of Murder and Storm. The blurb on the back mentioned Norse mythos and Ragnarok, the end of a Viking world with a terrible winter that covered the earth in ice, when vile crimes were rampant and all humanity lost. I could see how somebody impressionable might get it into their head that we were at the end of time. I was also beginning to see what the nightclub and its owner were all about.
This line is fantastic because it really speaks to the audience as well, with the game almost being self-referential here. It is confirming that its apocalyptic view of the city is what the game is portraying, while also having Max ironically mention how insane that idea is, and that only a lunatic like Lupino would believe it's actually the end of the world. A time where vile crimes run rampant and all humanity is lost appears to be exactly what Max is fighting against, perhaps without even realising it at this point. The line also perfectly summarises Nicole Horne, the villain of the game who is later revealed. She essentially runs her entire operation off of vile crimes and completely lacks any kind of humanity. It's also interesting that the drug Valkyr is associated with Valhalla, that is Old Norse heaven. The name itself references the beautiful maidens that would carry people to it. This both foreshadows that Valkyr is a failed military project, but it also serves a big dose of irony. Valkyr seems to be a completely hellish drug that drags people into violent insanity, quite the opposite of a buzz that makes the user feel good. The fact that people in this version of New York consume a drug as horrible as Valkyr really speaks to the degeneracy of the city. What kind of world would you want to take a drug that turns you into a lunatic just to escape from your environment for a few hours? We actually see very few Valkyr addicts who aren't rambling and raving in an insane fashion, although not all of them are immediately violent. By taking all these elements, Max Payne balances the gritty realism of New York with these outlandish and disturbing aspects to create a location that uniquely captures early 2000s American city life, while also twisting and exaggerating certain elements. It's interesting that in many ways, Max Payne turns New York into a backdrop for a struggle against pure good and pure evil. The city itself acts as an adversary to Max in this struggle, an environment that aids the unjust and malignant people of the city. He has to climb across dangerous icy rooftops and cling to trains that travel, to quote Max, through dead forests of dark antennas. The city docks are shown to be used for shady deals and smuggling, filled with rats and oily water. Even the police seem to struggle to traverse the city to catch Max, while the mafia goons he's fighting seem completely at home in the city. All of this increases a feeling of loneliness and isolation in the player, coupled with the snowstorm outside. The most senior villains of the game, Acer Corporation, are interesting in that they occupy the wealthy downtown portion of Manhattan and show that even the seemingly respectable elite of the city can be deeply evil and corrupt. Throughout the game we go from rundown slums and hotel blocks to a huge gleaming skyscraper, yet the foes Max encounters all across New York are just as despicable as each other regardless of their level of wealth or social class. In terms of the actual game environment, one way Max Payne engrosses players in this version of New York is by making many items in the world interactive. This goes far beyond what most modern games bother with, and again is testament to the skill and foresight of the developers. Players can interact with many different lockers, doors, drawers, random pieces of furniture. Sometimes you'll find hidden items, sometimes they'll simply be empty. You can interact with water coolers and watch bubbles appear inside them. The game also tells story through news reports and TV shows. These are just simple static images, sometimes even just staticky screens that sort of give way to a graphic novel presentation. But it's a great way again of making New York feel real. It's a larger world that actually has TV shows and modern media going on in the background, and it's all just a backdrop to Max's adventure, something he's not even directly involved in. Another touch I really like are the excellent photos on the loading screens. These are sort of photoshopped over the top sort of snowstorm representations of New York. I presume they're taken from real photos, and they're just really stylish. They're so well done. Whoever took these, they had a great talent for photography. Every single one of them is interesting. In the chapter where Max is captured by the mafia and is being interrogated by Frankie the Bat Niagara, we see this strange sort of run-down building in the photograph, and it's just interesting. It's hard to point to it. It doesn't show any particular narrative here, but it echoes Max's position in the game. He's in deep trouble, and here we see this horrible condemned sort of slum block. At the docks we get a very gritty kind of portrayal of a snowy, grim tanker sort of arriving with its cargo. Maybe not even the one Max is on, but again it's emblematic of the thing that he's in, this sort of urban decay that he's part of. I particularly like the photos used for An Empire of Evil, the chapter where Max is fighting against Jack Lupino in his shady club. It's simply a sort of New York pastiche of buildings that's completely confusing to look at, very much similar to what Max is going through himself in this strange and bizarre nightclub full of sort of human sacrifices and a devil-worshipping, insane, drug-crazed mafia man. Max also explicitly references the rotten core of the Big Apple when leading up to the fight with Jack Lupino.
This was the rotten core of the Big Apple. Lupino lurked somewhere ahead, like a spider at the center of his web, waiting.
This again supports the idea that the whole city seems to be on the side of the mafia and the wrongdoers in the story. Interestingly, though, as I mentioned, the city seems to benefit the villains of the story, it's also notable that the cops, with the exception of the DEA character Bibi, who is corrupt, the cops are generally shown to be good people. Your partner Alex at the beginning is another good guy. Police Chief Jim Bravura is trying to do the right thing over the game, and it's shown that the mayor is actually trying to crack down on the Valkyr drug problem. He's threatened with assassination for doing this. So it's interesting that while they're not shown, a lot of characters in the city are actually good, despite the extremely grim portrayal of the city, and are trying to sort of wrestle it back from what it's become. This adds even more to the atmosphere of the city, because it's like this ongoing struggle that we never see. We're just aware that we're part of it. There's even a radio broadcast later in the game where Max's vigilantism, where he's shooting all these bad guys, it becomes noticed, and instead of being sort of chased as a criminal, the news reporter mentions that people are actually now on Max's side because he seems to be cleaning the city up in a way that the police haven't managed to do for decades. That's also a lovely little touch that really adds a bit of character to the Noir York City sort of setting, and how degenerate is this city that someone killing a bunch of criminals might actually be a hero to the city. The gunplay mechanics in the game also went far beyond most other games at the time. The environmental effects and particle systems still hold up quite well today. Fire and debris effects are quite good and add to the mood of the shootouts in the city. The developers also put so much effort into the little details. These environmental details really pay off. I was going to go into more details about the environments in this section, but I think actually we've covered the broad strokes aspects of New York in Max Payne. Most of the environmental details for individual levels are more relevant to the tone of the game, which is what I'm going to discuss in the next chapter, so let's talk about it there. Chapter 3. The Perfect Tone. Perhaps the greatest writing achievement of Sam Lake in creating Max Payne is his mastery of tone. He's able to portray New York City as a dark, brooding and apocalyptic place, while simultaneously showing the city as capable of being redeemed. Max is a tough and violent anti-hero, while also remaining darkly humorous, charming, and not reduced to the level of the killers he's up against. The villains of the game are a brilliant example of the way the tone is masterfully juggled. The first boss enemies in the game are Joey and Virgilio Finito. I'll just let the game introduce them for me.
Lupino ran his racket of sex, drugs, and contract killings from a sleazy hotel in a slum block of tenements. The NYPD was closing in. I could hear the sirens. Their wail was a crescendo. Lupino thought he could get us by taking Alex out and leaving me to take the fall for it. All he had gotten was my attention. I went for the hotel first. It was a sad old thing with flickering lamps and faded colors. Cheap mobster punks and tired-eyed prostitutes. I walked straight in, playing at Bogart, like I'd done 100 times before. The place was run by a couple of murdering mobsters with shark smiles. The Finito brothers.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's the pain in the butt. Pain to the max.
You're killing me. Did you make that up yourselves, or you get some wino downstairs to come up with it? Don't answer that. A rhetorical question. I got something for the boss. Lupino around?
That kind of depends on who's asking. A friend or a junk squad plan. Don't answer. It's one of them, how do you put it, rhetorical questions. Lupino ain't here, but he says bye.
Lupino wasn't in his cheap hotel. Instead, I ran into the Finito brothers. My cover had been blown. The door slammed shut behind me. And then I was dodging bullets like raindrops.
Pain in the butt. Ha ha! Pain to the max. Junk squad pig. Got a ticket to Harbor City. First and lying down. Bring it in.
We have the goofy, over-the-top style of the graphic novel format, the humorous, wisecracking dialogue, as well as the absurd idea that these guys are literally named Finito. Then we get this exchange from their boss, Vinny Gogniti.
The V deal goes down at your hotel. Jack's exact words, quote, "Vinny, you're in charge of this one," unquote. Rico Muerte's coming to see it through. Anything goes wrong and everybody's gonna get dead. Goes double for you. Treat this guy real good. Anything he wants, you give him. Don't screw this up or you're finito, finitos.
It's funny and over-the-top silliness, yet at the same time, Max refers to the Finito brothers as murdering mobsters with shark smiles, and the news report on their deaths refers to them as notorious criminals. These descriptions hint that despite the levity and ridiculousness of Max's encounter with them, they're still deceptively nasty villains who fit the environment of the city. The same trick is pulled with the next bad guy, Rico Muerte. He's a mafia hitman and, hilariously, his name literally translates as rich from death. Rico itself is also a pun on the Rico laws, which allow mafia members to be tried as one organisation, even if they're not individually shown to be performing a crime. Max builds Muerte up as a really dangerous and evil man, yet what we see of him paints him as something of a clownish buffoon. It's another contrast that creates some comedy and levity, adds a feeling of the surreal to the game, and at the same time doesn't actually diminish Muerte's status as a villain. It's done carefully and cleverly. The game also has pop culture references, but it does these very subtly and in a way I really love. As an example, Max refers to Rico Muerte as a regular Kaiser Soze, a spook story told to keep the apes in line. This is a reference to the excellent crime thriller The Usual Suspects, in which Kaiser Soze is a terrifying criminal who strikes fear into others. Max's reference here is smartly done. It connects the game's version of New York and Max himself to the real world. He watches the same movies we do, despite apparently being in a completely awful version of New York. It also builds the mythos around Muerte, but at the same time it's a natural reference. It feels like Max is explaining Muerte's role in the mafia in an understandable way. This is unlike many references in modern media, which are done as silly memes rather than insertions into the story that make sense. In another example, there's a hidden room. The player can find a dead man with a stake driven into his heart. The words buff are written in blood on the floor. It's a clear and silly reference to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but here's the great thing. This man is found in this state in a hotel overrun with crazed drug addicts off of their minds on Valkyr. We know Valkyr drives people crazy, so this actually functions as both a funny reference and something quite disturbing when you think about it more. We know films and shows we watch exist in the Max Payne universe because he talked about Kaiser Soze earlier, so you can imagine what happens when someone driven mad by Valkyr gets hold of a wooden stake and an unfortunate victim. It's a goofy reference, but again, something that writers and developers have worked hard to make actually make sense in their game's world. Other pop culture references include John Woo, a brief mention of the X-Files, and the movie Pulp Fiction. The Pulp Fiction reference is so subtle that many players don't even notice it's in the game as a Pulp Fiction reference. At the same time, the humour and serious parts of the game are kept entirely separate. This is something I think a lot of modern games and films are really bad at. They constantly mix the two tones in a way that neither really feels effective. By contrast, Max Payne is actually confident enough with storytelling to dive into real horror and drama as well as these little moments of humour. The deaths of Max's family at the start of the game are really unnerving and sad, especially the grim portrayal of the merciless elimination of Max's baby daughter. It's really dark stuff, and the game doesn't gloss over it, even going as far as to show Max's PTSD through repeated nightmare levels. These levels are very well done and reinforce that the loss of Max's family is a huge tragic event, not just some throwaway plot point to start the game. Sam Lake is actually able to mix humour into a Valkyr drug-induced nightmare by breaking the fourth wall, but notably he does this right at the start of the scene. The humour is then removed and it becomes a serious psychological horror level, culminating in some great character development for Max as he metaphorically kills his survivor's guilt and shame over surviving his family's death.
The weird piece of paper looked dangerous. There was something disturbingly familiar about the letter before me. The handwriting was all pretty curves.
You're in a computer game, Max.
The truth was a burning green crack through my brain, weapon statistics hanging in the air glimpsed out of the corner of my eye, endless repetition of the act of shooting, time slowing down to show off my moves, the paranoid feel of someone controlling my every step. I was in a computer game. Funny as hell, it was the most horrible thing I could think of.
You killed her!
Similarly, Jack Lupino's nightclub, in which he carries out drug-crazed ritual sacrifices of his own men, is portrayed as a creepy and disturbing location. We get enemy dialogue where they say that they're actually frightened of their boss. Max goes as far as to call the location the rotten core of the Big Apple, again bringing us back to New York as a dystopia. Lupino himself is not portrayed as funny or amusing despite his over-the-top crazy antics. Instead, it's like you're taking a step into a nightmare, but you're aware that Max is fully awake.
I've seen it. The corruption of flesh. Ow! I'm the wolf, yeah! I am the wolf! It's close. It's coming. You have come. Witness to the end of time. It's now! I will rise to her side! I don't need the words! I'm beyond the words! I've tasted the devil's green blood. It runs in my veins. I've seen beyond a world of skin, the architecture of blood and bow and arrow. Death is coming! She is coming, and hell follows with her. This is the twilight winter. I am ready to be her son. Her time is now, and all who stand in her way must die!
There's a small environmental detail I really love in the Ragnarok Club, and I haven't seen anyone else discuss it. The band is called Choosers of the Slain, and they appear to be a rock or metal band. Disturbingly, the band stage is right before the backstage area where Lupino is sacrificing people. Does this imply that the band literally chooses people in the crowd to be sacrificed? A very subtle, creepy detail that builds on Max describing the club as bondage games leading to nasty stuff from there. It's interesting that Nicole Horne, the main villain of the game, is portrayed entirely without the use of humour. I'll be discussing her in depth in a later section, as she's really quite a fascinating foe for Max. In general, the game follows an intelligent pattern of showing early villains like the Finitos and Vinnie Gogniti to be ridiculous and clownish, while showing later enemies to be really quite unhinged, dangerous and devoid of any kind of silliness. As the stakes of the story escalate, the humour is slowly bled out. Max also references the humour and cliches used in the game, subtly justifying their use throughout. The darker and more grim moments in the game work excellently, also due to the wonderfully memorable dialogue lines that Max and other characters get throughout the game. One of my particular favourites occurs during a scene where he chases the injured Vinnie Gogniti, noting that
Vinnie Gogniti was running scared. He could run, but with a bullet in his stomach like a broken bottle of Tabasco, he was quickly running out of time. He knew where his boss was, and I wanted to square things up with Jack Lupino. Gogniti would be moving fast. I don't know about angels, but it's fear that gives men wings.
I don't know about angels, but it's fear that gives men wings. What a line that is. I still remember that line as a kid. Also, once again, Sam Lake is referencing the supernatural here, connecting us back to that strange Noir York City Norse mythology. One final detail before we move to the next chapter. I like how the game uses a horror TV show to mimic the horror in Max's own life. The Pink Flamingo show, which acts as a precursor to the second game's Address Unknown show, is shown on a random TV during one part of the game. The cry of a baby is heard morphing from a scream. Coincidentally, the developers use the same sound of Max's daughter crying. This blurs the lines between Max reliving his real PTSD trauma and this weird creepy TV program he's seeing. Once again, it's clever and unnerving presentation and writing that doesn't clash with the rest of the game. Chapter 4, Perfecting Foreshadowing. A great deal of the narrative atmosphere in Max Payne's environment comes from excellent use of foreshadowing. Max Payne is a game that uses more foreshadowing than most I've ever played. The first example of this is when Max arrives in his house prior to the murder of his family. He states that something ugly had been tattooed on the wall.
Michelle, honey, anybody home? I didn't like the way the show started, but they'd given me the best seat in the house, front row center. What the hell? Something ugly had been tattooed on the wall, a map of things to come. It was a poison syringe, a magic tag full of diabolical meanings.
We see the first iteration of the Valkyr symbol graffitied on his wall, foreshadowing the later appearance of variations of this symbol all over the city and the connection to a military research project called Valhalla. The villainess Nicole Horne even contacts Max's phone directly right after this, leaving a surreal and mysterious threatening message.
Listen, someone's broken into my house. Call 911.
Is this the Payne residence?
Yes, someone's broken into my house. They're still here. You have to...
Good. I'm afraid I cannot help you.
Who is this? Hello?
Connected to this are minor background details. We have Acer Corporation appearing in the first level, set during a bank robbery staged from a subway station. The company first appears as part of an advertisement in the first playable area with their "a bit closer to heaven" tagline, in hindsight providing an ironic hint that these are the bad guys. We then see the mafia-backed robbers are after Acer Corporation bonds.
The bank robbers have been after Acer Corporation bonds. The Acer success story had recently been on every channel and on the cover of every magazine.
This is a brilliant and often overlooked piece of foreshadowing in the story. We later learn that Acer controls the mafia, so they are using them in the very first level to steal from their own bearer bonds and resell them on the black market. The company could then claim on insurance and collect the value of the bonds twice. At the same time, Max and his DEA colleague are manipulated to the scene by corrupt DEA agent BB to be blamed for the robbery and also assassinated at the scene. It's a brilliant little detail that straight away shows that Asa is involved in many illegal things, not just drug manufacture of Valkyr. The game never overtly states what was going on at the Roscoe Street robbery, but it's just subtly revealed as the plot continues. The seemingly random crime in the subway all adds up in the end. Around the city we also see choir communications billboards with the slogan "The Voice of the Angels." This directly ties into the deranged ramblings of Valkyr addicts who frequently reference the flesh of fallen angels. It's a nice little Easter egg and also explains that some of the common ramblings of the addicts seem to come from their observations of the environment around them. In Ragnarok nightclub, before we meet Jack Lapino, we see the words "Big Bad Fenris Wolf" scrawled in huge graffiti on a wall. 20 minutes later we meet Lapino himself. As his name suggests, Lapino believes himself to be a harbinger at the end of the world and uses the exact words "Big Bad Fenris Wolf" to describe himself. I never actually saw this graffiti anywhere else in the game, it's just hidden in a dark corner at the start of the nightclub level. It's a really cool little subtle detail. Another excellent piece of narrative foreshadowing is used in the Punchinello family manor. The Don's wife is referred to by Max as a bit of a witch, and apparently predicts the future with tarot cards.
The word on Lisa Punchinello was that she was a bit of a witch. The tarot cards on the kitchen table fit the picture. They weren't my kind of cards, but I was willing to take a crack at the hand Mrs. Punchinello had dealt. The first card was the tower. Maybe that was supposed to be the manor. It got easy after that. The devil was the master of the house, and death was me, coming for him.
These cards show the tower, the devil, and death. Max incorrectly assigns the meaning of the tower as the Mafia Manor, the devil being Don Punchinello, and Max himself representing death. In reality, the tower represents Asa Plaza, the skyscraper headquarters of Asa Corporation. The devil is Nicole Horne, who surpasses the Mafia boss's level of evil, though Max did get the death part right, as he brings an end to her schemes. What other games in recent memory use a piece of random environmental detail like this to tell the narrative? It's really great stuff. The game also does a wonderful job of setting up new enemies as threats in advance. First we have a mention of Vinnie Gogniti significantly before his appearance. It establishes him as a pathetic and kind of funny character because we hear his voice through the letter on the Finito brothers' desk. The pattern's repeated over and over again, with a slow build-up to Rico Muerte, then the psychotic Jack Lapino, and the treacherous Boris Dime. The final villains to be built up like this are Punchinello's trio, his special henchmen. After this though, the game shifts and gives way to the pursuit of only Nicole Horne. It's a great way to keep the player entertained with all these small enemies early in their adventure through the city, before focusing on one big bad guy to end the narrative. There are many other clever little details that I won't discuss further here. Needless to say, the game really pulls its weight when it comes to environmental storytelling. Chapter 5: Mystery, World Building, and the Larger Environment. The other thing that's fantastic about Max Payne's atmosphere is that it's packed with mysteries that are never resolved. An early example is Rico Muerte and what Don Punchinello refers to as the Chicago screw-up. It's clear Muerte owes the Punchinello family for some sort of mistake he made in Chicago, but we never find out what this is. Don Punchinello himself is later killed by Asa Corporation, and moments before this he shouts, "No, I told him nothing." What did Punchinello actually know about Asa? We never find out. We don't even find out how long the Mafia was working for Nicole Horne, though presumably it was after the loss of Max's family, as that's when the drug problem really took off. As an interesting little side note, you can note that in this scene that Punchinello's office is set out with 2 chairs in front of his desk in a classical style. Ironically, one of Horne's penthouse desks has the exact same setup in a modern style. A little subtle jab there that behaviour of some large corporations is perhaps not much different from the Mafia. One of my favourite little details is the presence of a cold steel foundry office in a random stairwell when the player is chasing Vinnie Gogniti. The door is locked, adding another dramatic irony when you replay the game, because you realise that Cold Steel is a company connected to manufacturing Valkyr. If Max had simply kicked this door down, he may have uncovered the whole mystery of the drug a lot faster. Or the office might have just had a bunch of outdated, irrelevant records. Little touches like this give the feeling of a much larger world. There are so many areas of New York relevant to Max's investigation, but he never gets to even explore them. When we do visit the Cold Steel smelting facility, it's perhaps the biggest enduring mystery in the game. By the time Max gets to the secret bunker that manufactures Valkyr, most of the staff have already been killed as part of a cover-up. Max gets one of the biggest narrative moments when he finds a computer explaining what happened to his family years ago.
Top secret. Project Valhalla. U.S. Army. Yggdrasil Network. Valhalla, the otherworldly place in Norse mythology, where the bravest heroes spent their afterlife feasting and fighting forever, their wounds miraculously healed night after night. Valkyr, the maidens who chose the most courageous Viking warriors and carried them to Valhalla. 1991. The research objective is to create a chemical substance to enhance the stamina and morale of infantry troops. 1995. Results unsatisfactory. Project cancelled.
Someone had decided to continue the sick experiment unauthorized.
Project compromised. Data leak. Fix the damage by any means necessary. Security clearance red. Authorized by the project lead. Field test. Double the dosage for all the remaining test subjects. Observe and record the subject's behavior in an urban setting.
The drop-off point was my old address in New Jersey. The file dated 3 years ago. Just when you thought you had reached the deepest depths of horror, it suddenly got worse. How to turn off that small voice inside your head that started to whisper that you should be glad that now, if not before, your revenge was justifiable on any conceivable moral scale. That small voice proved, beyond any doubt, that I was damned.
However, this is all we get to learn about Project Valhalla. Questions of how Nicole took over, how she kept everything a secret, and her background in the project are never mentioned. Was she a scientist? We see her wearing a lab coat, but that doesn't mean that she wasn't just a random government figure. This isn't a plot hole, but it's intriguing to think about, and the game lets us think about it ourselves. Similarly, the conspiracy Alfred Woden and Nicole Horne are part of, the Inner Circle, is left almost entirely unexplored. Much with great movies like The Thing, Max Payne knows when to deal in absolutes and when to leave us with ambiguities. The end result is that the game's version of New York feels like a sprawling, mysterious and dangerous place, rife with conspiracy and enigma. Finally, in this next chapter, before the conclusion, I'm going to talk about some enemy design, and Nicole Horne as a villain. I think she deserves her own coverage. Chapter 6. Enemy Design and Nicole Horne. Throughout the game, Max primarily faces off against modern-day mafia thugs. In keeping with some of the tone of the game discussed previously, these guys are almost like caricatures, with over-the-top voice lines and death screams. They have thick New York accents and will often scream things like, "Whack him!" or "Ice him!" upon seeing Max.
Whack the sucker!
Once again, this slightly absurd characterization actually fits really well as part of the over-the-top world of the game. Slowly, as Acer Corporation gets more involved, Max would be fighting mercenaries, private security guards, and suit-wearing elite hitmen. The latter are like human equivalents to the Matrix's agents, although they're a homage rather than any kind of rip-off. The game uses graphics for enemies that would be considered primitive by today's standards, but actually I think they hold up quite well. The reason for this is that developers bother to use a series of photographs for each enemy's face. Enemies have a standard facial expression when not alerted, an enraged or panicky facial expression when they're shooting their weapons, and another expression when killed by gunfire. In slow motion, this actually leads to some cool moments. You'll see enemies grimacing dramatically while missing shots at Max, or their facial expressions slackening as they collapse to the floor, experiencing fatal leg concentrations. Does it look dated now? Yes, it does. But it still shows a lot of effort went into this stuff on a low budget. The characters are actually more expressive than many modern game enemies in combat situations. The photos also counterbalance the over-the-top absurdities of the voice lines too. Enemies look like regular people, only their aggression and yelling is cartoonish and outlandish. Because of the low budget, the enemies are also based off the developers' own faces. I've seen people say before that this makes them look dorky rather than sort of traditional cinema gangsters. I think it's quite a nice touch. They look like real people. It's actually something I'd like to see more of in games, like use normal people for the actual models and stuff. Don't just use models all the time. People don't look like models in real life. Interestingly, the game is very much self-aware on the over-the-top nature of the enemies. Max even describes one villain as another cardboard cutout bad guy. Enemies also have very goofy conversations throughout the game that lend some humour to the proceedings and a little bit of environmental detail. One of my favourites is a corporate hitman who explains to another henchman that it's simply his job to shoot people and otherwise he's a normal and balanced family man. This is proved false when Payne walks around the corner and the bad guy immediately starts screaming at him hatefully like some kind of maniac. However, the game even manages the tone of these sillier dialogue interactions. You only really hear them if you're standing around listening for Easter eggs in the game. If you're playing more casually, you're likely to miss a lot of the goofier dialogue, and the game preserves a more dark tone throughout. Speaking of dark tone, I wanted to save discussion of Nicole Horne for last. She's simply a fascinating villain. Horne is a completely evil and heartless woman who has immense power in New York and huge amounts of wealth to back it up. Really, she is no less than a monster, a person devoid of all humanity. In lesser stories, she could be seen as a one-dimensional villain, but I thought the game does a great job of using the very little we learn about her to make her seem even more cruel and awful. In many ways, Nicole is the absolute opposite of Max. Max is a working-class cop, a sort of everyman. He has a rich and loving personal life that is taken from him. He has friends and cares about the city, about making society better. He's not wealthy, but he's exceedingly human, even sparing the life of Vinnie Gogniti despite his rage at that point in the game. Nicole, on the other hand, is never shown to have any family or even friends. She's ferociously intelligent, but also completely Machiavellian. People only work for her because she pays them huge amounts of money or blackmails them. Outside of growing her business by any means necessary, she seems to have no tangible life goals or motivations beyond getting more power. As an older woman, you'd perhaps expect Nicole to have children and a loving family like Max. Traditionally, older women are seen as motherly figures, people with maternal instinct. I think this is one thing that makes Nicole such an incredibly twisted villain. She's the complete opposite of maternal, showing zero interest in family, and being cruel enough to have innocent people and even children killed in order to keep her illegal schemes safe. She dismisses the death of Max's family as necessary when it turns out that this evil act was perhaps completely pointless, as Max's wife didn't actually realise she'd stumbled on a criminal conspiracy. In many ways she could be called a total personification of evil, a complete psychopath, someone in society who is enormously successful but completely hollow, scarcely even experiencing life as a human being. She doesn't even seem to derive much pleasure from her massive wealth. She lives a luxurious life, but there's never any implication she enjoys it that much. Instead, she seems to simply relish the power she holds over others. It's also interesting that the mafia thugs and gangsters that Max has to deal with early in the game, he actually has a personal connection to. He's been undercover with these people for years. Jack Lupino and the others are definitely evil men, but they pale in comparison to someone as completely evil as Nicole Horne. Given the complete lack of Nicole Horne's personal life, she is the one who destroyed Max's personal life. Max's personal hatred and connection to Horne is stronger than with any of the thugs he fights throughout the game, yet ironically Horne sees the whole thing as just business. She took something that means nothing to her, human connection, and destroyed Max's life by removing his connection to his family. Interestingly, despite all of this, Nicole Horne does seem to have affection for one thing in her life, Valkyr. She refers to the drug as her brew in an almost loving tone, even playfully and seductively stroking her hair back before injecting Max with a near-deadly overdose of the drug. Perhaps this is because the drug allows her to control people and has given her control of the entire city. After all, if a pure psychopath loves and relishes one thing, it's control. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the video essay. Please let me know your comments below. Analysing a game like this is quite vast in scope actually, so I'm sure there's things I forgot to cover. I hope to do a video on Max Payne 2 once I get around to replaying it. I also plan to cover Half-Life 1 and 2 in exceptional environments, as we all love the Black Mesa Research Complex and City 17 of course. I will also try and cover two of my other favourite games ever, System Shock 2 and Deus Ex, two titles I think really did sort of a service to the immersive sim genre. Please do like and subscribe if you would like to see more content. I hope to make the channel updates more regular in the future. Thanks again for watching.